the talk I have constructed is more part academic and then also less academic. So please bear with me. I want to basically lay out some theoretical frameworks that I was interested in looking at for this project, and then I'll go into some of the chapters themselves that are thematic. But ultimately, the reason I even was interested in looking at a space like it started as abortion was that I was very frustrated with the lack of political engagement with our discipline, or architecture, if you're not within architecture. And I wanted to take on a subject matter that was inherently politicized in a way to force the intersection between architecture and space. And so for me, abortion and then the extension to women's shelters and hospitals became a way to start to tease out some bigger issues that were explicitly about politics, about culture, and about social influences and their impact on the way we understand and eventually physically access space. So I'm going to start with two brief film clips. One is from 1991 outside of the clinic in Wichita, Kansas. And the second one is from 2012, which a group of escorts from a clinic in Louisville, Kentucky. This one man I've been in touch with, he's filming quite regularly the protests there. And so I want to start with that because I think it offers some really interesting just visuals of what I'm interested in. So.
CBS Evening News. I'm Charles Kuralt, sitting in tonight for Dan Rather. Good evening. Anti-abortion demonstrators in Wichita, Kansas resumed their blockade of abortion clinics today for the first time since a federal judge threatened to send them to jail. This came just days after the Bush administration filed a court brief in support of the demonstrators and against the judge. Scott Pelley reports from Wichita.
In a calculated collision with a federal judge, Operation Rescue blockaded a Wichita abortion clinic today with violent results. The militant anti-abortion organization confronted federal marshals who were under orders to keep the clinics open. At least 98 demonstrators were arrested on charges ranging from trespassing to assaulting an officer.
I don't know what they're charging you with.
One of those arrested.
Over 90% of women that exterminate their children are doing it out of convenience. Please today repent and turn to Christ. It's so important. Again, as I said, we're getting all these programs. We clarify again. Mothers,
So although 21 years apart, in some ways not much has changed, sadly. And this happens every weekend, every Saturday outside this clinic in Louisville. And so the people in orange are the actual escorts, and the people with the green vest are the anti-choice people trying to subvert the clients, the patients and the employees to prevent them from getting into the clinic. So for me, the issue of physical access is one of the things that really drove me, besides the politicized nature of this space, to look at abortion clinics. And so ultimately, it's about the First Amendment. And I was starting to do a lot of research independent of this about the politics of space, how we understand public space, the public realm. And so it really started to intersect just intellectually with the interest in abortion clinics. So I just want to highlight that, and I'm sure you're all aware, but the First Amendment allows you freedom of speech and to peacefully assemble. And that's, I think, an operative word, because very often in these cases, it's not peaceful at all, but yet it's still allowed because the First Amendment is a major tenet of our founding. So there's interesting things that this research helps me think through, some of which are the complex relationships of space, a woman's body, varying degrees of federal and state control, the fluid and ever-shifting terrain of reproductive healthcare access, and potentials of design thinking in transforming spatial relationships and ways to rethink and find agency within them. So another motivation for this research was to reinsert architecture back into contemporary culture and the built environment. In the first book that Carlos had mentioned, the title being Feminist Practices, Interdisciplinary Approaches to Women in Architecture, I was interested in highlighting and working with a group of women who maybe consciously or unconsciously work in a feminist methodology, and some would actually, they didn't think they did, and then when I started talking to them, they started to see it in a different way. But trying to bring voice to those who are often silenced, or to those who communities through design, community design efforts, are able to actually participate in the building of their communities. So in the book, I was really interested in trying to expand the way we think about architecture, the role of the designer, in ways that feminist approaches to this are different, more inclusive than other types of practices. So this research itself definitely falls within that larger framework of trying to define practice more broadly. I also want to just briefly highlight the emergence of the project, because initially I thought I was going to be doing something completely different than what this ended up being. I originally thought I'd been volunteering with my local Planned Parenthood at the state fair every year, because I'm in Syracuse and that's where the state fair is. And I thought, oh, okay, I'll work with them. I want to interview patients and doctors and employees to understand how people experience and live through that contested space of getting out of your car or coming from the sidewalk and actually being able to get into the building. Well, it took a year and a half of going through several bureaucratic levels of Planned Parenthood, and they eventually said no, which I understand issues of security, but I was incredibly disappointed, and the fact that it was a year and a half that I had to wait, although continually trying to press them. But I felt like this project was worthwhile, but I didn't know anymore what the project was, but that the topic was something I still wanted to look at. So it really forced me to reframe the project, and I started to realize that it's not really about the micro clinic, but it's about the state, and how each state has the ability to restrict or create legislation that impacts a woman's ability and a doctor's ability to actually access reproductive health care. So what started out as thinking about the clinic on a site became looking at the issues of how our state legislatures starting to enact and continue to enact legislation that talks about physical, geographic issues that make it far more difficult for someone to get into that building. So it really shifted, became much larger in scale, which I think in the end became far more interesting as a way to speculate and think about, well, where is architectural agency within something like this? In addition to the expansion of looking at the state, it also expanded to look at all of North America. Originally, it was just the US, and then through working with the publisher Ashgate, they were encouraging me to really expand it to make it more broader based. And it took me a while to agree to do that because that was far more work, but in the end, I think it's far more interesting because Mexico and Canada deal with this issue very differently, and I had major misconceptions of what I thought they did, and I'm going to highlight just briefly some of that. In addition, the book also started to expand beyond abortion and take on issues of women's shelters and hospitals. Not to the same degree, but the issues of security are incredibly important, and the issues of public and private are incredibly important when we think about women's shelters and hospitals in comparison to clinics. And I will briefly mention throughout the talk some of these differences, but I want to focus more on abortion because that's the really broader or more in-depth research that I did. So thinking about these issues, like I mentioned with security, so for example, clearly we understand in the video that security getting to the front door is an issue, but when we start to think about women's shelters, I've been working with a local shelter in Syracuse in which the location is not public, so you have to call someone in order to find out where the location is in order to keep their space hidden. And so the issue of how we understand a women's shelter, how it gets publicized, it's only through the publicity that domestic violence actually becomes something happens, and it's in the reverse with abortion that it's an incredibly private issue of a woman's body, but it's so inherently publicized that there's an interesting contrast between the two. And then in terms of hospitals, I'm sure you've been to hospitals. Some hospitals you can walk right in, they don't even ask you your name. Others, you have to show an ID, you get a badge in order to even get into the elevator. So security starts to get played out in different ways. And even thinking about maternity areas in hospitals and psychiatric units, like security is really embedded within the programming within hospitals in ways that are far more complex than in either women's shelters or abortion clinics. So for me, this research, although Initially, I thought it was going to be about the building, about the site. It really became more about the political, social, and geographic sets of influences that affect the clinic to actually be able to exist, and the impact legislation has on the occupation of the built environment via the abortion clinic. So I want to just highlight a few things about my methodology. I want to state that I definitely use feminist methods to try and disrupt power structures and reveal power inequalities within these topics. And I'm very interested in questioning how we define architectural universal knowledge and who produces this knowledge. And I want to try through this work to recontextualize and repoliticize knowledge and knowledge production. And I just want to quote the philosopher Sandra Harding. She's written about these issues in terms of research, and she says that these broader definitions of feminist research and methodology remind us that it's not only the research questions asked, but also those that are not asked that become influential in understanding the larger research potential. As well, she articulates one important component of feminist research is that it is generated from the experiences of women. These experiences are critical for the larger concerns of social life in general. For women should have an equal say in the design and administration of the institutions where knowledge is produced and distributed for reasons of social justice. So clearly we are all products of our own environments. What we do shapes what we know and how we practice what we know. So I feel like it's very important to locate this research within this broader context of feminist methodologies, which has had lots of writing in the humanities and social sciences, but not near as much within the architectural realm. Additionally, this was the first time I interviewed people as part of a project. My colleagues in geography do this all the time, but it was a very new process for me. And it was suggested at one point that wouldn't it be interesting and important to have on-the-ground knowledge of the impacts of these. So I went around the country and interviewed only independent providers. So Planned Parenthood, I had no luck with Planned Parenthood, but independent providers were actually very open and willing to meet with me. They even were allowing me, if I wanted, to publish their names or locations in the book, but I didn't for issues of security. But they were willing to have that happen, which speaks to their trust in the project. But I wanted to be able to provide a place for their voice to be heard. So clearly my positionality is part of this, but I think the media does not represent providers as well and as often as they do the anti-choice side. So this is an opportunity, although more of an academic press, for their voice to have a place. So because of interviewing providers, and trying to think about access, I started to think about the chain of events. So clearly there's the abortion clinic, but if we start to think spatially about, well, what happens before that? So for example, if pharmacies actually stocked and sold contraception and emergency contraception, maybe there would be no need to actually get to a clinic. Or if hospitals once again became more practicing of abortion, there wouldn't be the issue of only having one clinic in 3 or 4 states in this country. So myself and research assistants called all the pharmacies in the most contested states, which that's also a shifting terrain, but we called all the pharmacies in Nebraska, Utah, North and South Dakota, Kentucky, and Mississippi to see if pharmacies stocked and sold emergency contraception, or if they stocked it but wouldn't sell it, or if they didn't stock it at all. And I'm going to give you Mississippi as a case study to show you we created this database of what the responses were, what was the sex of the gender of the pharmacists we spoke with, and then there are sometimes off-the-wall comments that we would get if they had not hung up on us. So that's part of this literature, part of the book as well. And one last person I'd like to highlight is Elizabeth Gross. She was really instrumental in more broadly thinking about the role of architecture in society. And she's written a lot, I'm sure most of you are familiar with her work writing about bodies and cities. They're mutually constructed, and they affect one another. She was really critical in framing some of the larger issues of this project, as were some of the political theorists such as Nancy Fraser and Iris Marion Young, who've written quite extensively about public space and thinking about ways to use public space to shame certain political actors. And I just want to highlight Iris Marion Young. She talks about the public sphere as being incredibly important as a place to exert power on, for example, legislatures and the people who are decision makers. But she says the power resides in the ability to uncover, expose, publicize, and even shame powerful actors. In so doing, ordinary citizens' use of the public sphere is one way to limit power and hold these actors accountable. So this is something I've been thinking about a lot in terms of this project and the role of the public space and how can the pro-choice side be as successful in exerting pressure as the anti-choice side has. So for me, the issue is literally about the boundary in space, which I will get to. I'm going to highlight one court case that demonstrates that very clearly. But so in the research, when I realized it's not going to happen at the site of a clinic, I started looking at the states. And so I started to look at how many providers exist per state and map that across. So, for example, Mississippi has one, North and South Dakota have one, and there's major push in these states to eliminate providers altogether, even though that would be against Roe v. Wade. Additionally, and I'll zoom in just a minute, I was interested in looking at what were the restrictions. Like, this was whole new territory for me outside of what I was familiar with. And so I wanted to understand what were these restrictions and then map them across the state. And I want to highlight a few because I think some of them are kind of appalling. So you've probably heard of the 24-hour delay. Some states are trying to make it longer. There's certain states require only physicians rather than other types of medical professionals to provide the procedure. There's some states prohibit public facilities being used for the procedure. In certain states, it's on the books that illegal that if you're married, your husband has to consent to the procedure. That one was really shocking to me. And then more recently, I'm sure you've heard the ultrasound rule, where ultrasound is required for a woman she has to undergo one before she can actually have an abortion, and that's one of the more, calling it the ultrasound rape issue. So that's probably the most recent egregious one that has been passed. So looking at the number of restrictions across the state, and I might add that clearly the more restrictions it would appear to be the worst, but if we look at Mississippi, there's 13, and that's one of the most restrictive states, but Missouri only has 15, so it's not always about the number, but it could be about the severity or the extent how restrictive they are. So this court case, I was interested in how is our public realm and the space around clinics actually being defined and dimensioned. So I want to highlight Colorado versus Hill, which the Supreme Court decided this in 2000, but it actually began in the Boulder City Council in 1986. And I want to highlight this one because it was the earliest one that impacts other cases later. They originally in Boulder were having huge protests. The anti-choice movement was incredibly successful in preventing people from getting into the front door. And so, like you saw in the film, people laying on the ground, it was quite extensive. So the city council came up with the buffer zone ordinance. And what that did was it put a dimension around the building, so 100 feet around the building you could not pass, and then 8 feet around a person coming in and out of that 100-foot zone, you had to have the consent to speak to. And it's interesting, I found it interesting how they decided 8 feet. So there were two people and two legislators in the basement, and they literally were walking around with their arms out and saying, "Can you hear me? Can you hear me?" And at a certain point, they were 2 arms lengths away, and you could hear the other person, and your voice wasn't raised, and that was 8 feet. So that's how that 8-foot dimension, this bubble, got created, which is kind of arbitrary in a way, but it has incredible power legally. So eventually, the state passed it in 1993, and then it went to the Supreme Court in 2000. They upheld what the Colorado state government had created. So the thing that it got me thinking about is if we can legislate certain distances that prevent or protect people within clinics, but the courts are very conservative in doing so because they don't want to burden too much free speech. Free speech has to prevail. And at a certain point, after reading a lot of these critiques by law professors, it seemed that the real geography was not actually being considered in the same way that the issue of free speech was. Now, I'm not a lawyer, this is not my area of expertise, but I'm wanting to understand it from a spatial perspective. So I started wondering, are there other spaces in our country that are legislated in terms of not allowing or shutting down free speech? Well, around voting booths, polling places, you can't be 100 feet from the door and speak, have any political language. So they're willing to say 100 feet from polling, we can shut down free speech or limit free speech. The other thing that was quite interesting, and this is rather recent in the last 2 years, I believe, you see the yellow line around the Supreme Court building. Well, you can't protest right in the plaza of the Supreme Court. You have to be on the outside of that line. So they're controlling the amount of speech that can happen around their building, the Supreme Court justices. And the last one that happened, and this overrode a Supreme Court decision, was again with Obama signed in 2012, that you couldn't protest around military funerals because it was hate speech. The Supreme Court was saying, no, it's actually free speech and we should allow it, but he signed a law saying you couldn't be within 300 feet of a military funeral either 2 hours before or 2 hours after. So that got me thinking about, well, at what point does the issue around abortion access start to be compared with some of these examples? Because from the people I interviewed, there are severe and serious issues, especially in the South and has been in Kansas, of not being able to have protection. So at what point does the geography start to weigh in as much as the issue of free speech? I don't have an answer, but that's something that this research is really trying to ask. Now, another thing a lot of the Supreme Court decisions started to do was define these spatial terms. So as you saw with Colorado and Hill, there's no approach zones or fixed zones, there's floating zones around people. And then from a case in '92 in Florida, Madison versus Women's Health, the noise levels were so loud that women would have to have more sedation because they were so distraught when they get in the clinic, that they had to start to limit the sound, the noise levels outside of clinics, as well as the sizes of images observable. They would have these enormous signs that you could see from the clinic. So they started to limit the size that these images could be. So just a quick comparison that I want to highlight with Canada and Mexico. Canada is interesting because their healthcare system is quite different. As you probably are aware, it's universal care. However, it's carried out through each province. And that's where it starts to get a bit gray. So, and also in Canada, you usually more typically access abortion care through hospitals, although I'll highlight a few provinces that have more clinics. So you'll notice these numbers are the number of hospitals that you can access. So in less populated areas, there's clearly going to be fewer hospitals, but I want to highlight Prince Edward Island that has no access whatsoever. It's a federal law that you have to be able to provide abortion care, and they're breaking the federal law. And the other thing I want to highlight is in Canada, Roe v. Wade was passed in 1973. In 1988, R versus Morgenthaler was passed, which liberalized abortion. They have the most liberal abortion policy in the world. They have no limit whatsoever. So time-wise, although they're later, they're far ahead of us in so many ways. But with Prince Edward Island, it's a huge problem because these women have to seek care off, they have to leave the island and go somewhere else. And what's started to happen, and people are starting to write about this, is it's through insurance of the province where they're starting to limit or curtail access. So if I live in, we'll say, if I live in Prince Edward Island and then I have to go off the island to seek an abortion, I have to find out whether the provinces will pay, like cross-province payment. And this is where they've started to really tighten, especially in the more conservative provinces, access. So there's become issues about provinces not paying across province lines. I also just want to highlight, so for example, Quebec has 31 hospitals and 26 clinics, and Ontario also has 33 and I think 18. Those are the two provinces with the most clinic access. But because you can get access in a hospital, it's not as big of an issue, but there's still distance concerns. And then in Mexico, Mexico is one of the most conservative and restrictive countries in Latin America. However, in the 2000s, the federal district, which is Mexico City, started to liberalize their policies. So where you see in other states, where you see the gray areas are states that in the 2000s began to liberalize their policies. What's happened as a result is that there's been cross-state travel to seek abortion care. And in Mexico City, they've actually built hospitals explicitly for women seeking abortion. So the gray bars are the states that have more liberal policies, and their restrictions are not near as, say, nuanced as the U.S., but yet incredibly strict. So basically, you can get an abortion if you've been raped, if it's been due to an accident, which how you define an accident is questionable, that if there's a risk to the woman's life, if there's a fetal impairment, if there's a risk to the woman's health, which is another area of gray, and other causes. So but it's incredibly difficult if you're living in rural areas to actually access care. So another part of this research was interested in looking at, are there other people, groups who've used space in interesting ways or misread space in interesting ways in order to provide care? And I want to highlight three. The first is Jane. So this, Jane was founded in the late 60s, in 1969, really by some college students and women who lived in Chicago. And they at first were just a referral service. Like who are safe providers that we can refer women to? And as a result of sort of getting into this network and starting to work more closely with the people providing abortions, they realized that they weren't doctors at all, but they were men who had been trained to do this procedure. So they realized, well, if he learned how to do it, we can learn how to do it. So they learned how to do it and started providing their own abortion service. And the thing that was so interesting, so you would have to call a message in the answering machine, leave a message. You would be, for Jane, your call would be returned. You would set up a counseling time. That was really important, especially within the women's liberation of 70s and the late 60s. Like, it was about empowerment, it was about education. Once the counseling happened and a dollar amount was agreed upon, then you would wait for the day before you'd receive a call for the time and location that you're supposed to show up. The thing that was so fascinating was that these happened in domestic spaces, and they would, first it was people in the group's houses or apartments that they would do this in, and it was always divided. So basically the reception was what they called the front, and the place, literally these are their terms, was where the procedure would happen, and you would be driven back and forth. And so this created a barrier of anonymity, of safety. Eventually they were raided, and it allowed less people to be arrested because it was dispersed between these two locations. But they did go to jail but got released, and then Roe v. Wade was passed, and so the charges were dropped. But I was interested because they used domestic space as a space of empowerment, where when we think about women's shelters, it's the space where abuse happens. So it's a complete reversal of thinking about the domestic realm as a space where they were empowering themselves and other women. Another really interesting case study was with the Clergy Consultation Service on Abortion here in New York. They were founded in the late 60s as well. There were 21 religious, ministers, rabbis who wanted to also provide a safe referral system for women. And they realized a year into this, well, first let me highlight, so unlike maybe what we think today, I mean, this is a generalization, but they believed that their religious, they had an obligation transcending legal codes, and that it was their responsibility and religious duty to give aid and assistance to all women with problem pregnancies. I mean, we have to suspend the issue of problem pregnancies, but the fact that they wanted to do this, so they created this service. It was announced in the New York Times, formally announced publicly. All of the people involved were listed, their churches were listed, their addresses were listed. I mean, this is crazy in a way. They had consulted with the ACLU because they wanted to try to do this as cleverly as possible to put pressure on New York State to try and change their law. So they wanted to do things as legally as possible, although the whole thing was illegal. So a year into this, they realized they were only serving white women of means, and they were missing the whole lower economic women of color who were the ones who needed this service probably even more in terms of issues of money. So they consulted with the congregation in the West Village, and they were having trouble. They decided they were going to open an abortion clinic on their own. It was going to be supported by the church, and they were having trouble locating space. And so the congregation agreed that they could use space on church property for this abortion clinic. So they were about to begin construction, and the New York State Legislature then they changed their abortion policy and made it legal, so they never were officially had to open a clinic on church property, but started to consult with those who were beginning to open clinics. Which I found this a fascinating example. I had no idea. I mean, I've heard that there are radical church-affiliated people, but to have read this and to see in the level at which they were willing to do this was, I think, pretty fascinating. And the last case study, which I know Columbia, I think it was last semester, had Dr. Rebecca Gomertz, who started Women on Waves here. She started this in 1999. It was designed by Atelier Van Leeuwen. And it's basically a shipping container that gets attached to a boat and travels to countries where abortion is illegal. The thing that is so interesting to me about this is, and then there's an image, sorry, of the interior, a very nice interior, actually. They sail to countries where abortion is illegal, where they're invited, and they dock 12 miles out. And at that point, you're in international waters. So Dutch law prevails. In Dutch law, abortion is legal. And women are ferried from the host country out, and during the ferry, they can receive information, legal and medical information, contraception, ultrasounds, and once the ship is docked in international waters, they then can receive the abortion pill, but not until that point, because Dutch law has to prevail. And I just want to quote Carrie Lambert-Beatty, who's a professor and art critic at Harvard, because she's talked about this project as an instance of feminist activism and an art project. And she says, using the radical idea that the power of one nation state over the bodies of its women could be evaded by a short boat trip registered to another is both outrageous in its simplicity as well as its implications, using international waters as a refuge for women's rights. And I just think it's, in terms of how you misread or read differently the legal boundaries between countries, globalization tactics, I just think this was such a smart way to go against the way we understand the legal countries' definitions of their statehood. And then they've gone to Ireland, Poland, Portugal, Spain, and Ecuador, as well as established hotlines in Chile, Peru, Pakistan, and Venezuela. So that gets me to Mississippi, and I'll wrap up after this. So Mississippi is one of the more restrictive states, and by Gallup Politics, it's rated as the most conservative state in all of the U.S. It has the highest rate of teen pregnancy and only allows for abstinence-only education. So it's a state that has a lot of issues. I want to start with another clip from a Frontline episode called The Last Abortion Clinic, and you're going to hear the former director of the clinic speak.
Is lightning and lighteth the world.
It is quite difficult for a physician to live here in the state, in the city,
The heavens declares righteousness.
and not be harassed.
It's just a scare tactic is all it is. It's not a scare tactic.
There's other options other than trying to take the life of this unborn child. Your parents.
So I want you to remember that fence, because it's going to come back at the end of this. But having gone there and met with both the director and the owner of the clinic, they're incredibly committed to keeping this clinic open, and the state is incredibly committed to trying closing it. So I was interested in looking at what are the larger cultural, political, social influences weighing down on this, and what's the context that this is existing in. So there's a series of mappings that happened for each of the states that I looked at. So first was looking at where our clinic or clinics located, and in this case, it's Jackson. And then looking at if a woman doesn't have a car, which is not that unusual, It's an incredibly poor state. And most of the women that are seeking abortion in this clinic are quite poor. So what's the distances and dimensions they have to go through to get there? So I didn't write it down, but actually I can just quote you. So for example, if you live in Hattiesburg, it's going to take a little over 2 hours. It costs $50 round trip. But so that's one example. You'll notice that there's bordering states with clinics as well. So if you are lucky enough that the distance is shorter, then you could cross a state line. But Mississippi has a lot of restrictions. One being that you have to wait 24 hours, another being that the physician herself has to administer the counseling both individually and with group, and because there's issues about the number of parking spaces that the clinic has, they can't overschedule patients. So it becomes this hugely complex issue of how do you get enough women in regularly within this cycle. So you may wait a week, you may wait far longer than a week to come back after you've been counseled. So I started to see how complicated this becomes. Oh, you wait 24 hours, but the repercussions of that wait are enormous. You also have to pay to get there again, you have to pay for childcare, you may have to pay for a motel or a hotel while you're there. So it starts to compound the issue. I was also interested in looking at poverty because clearly, as both the director and the owner told me, a lot of poor women are trying to seek care there. So Mississippi is an incredibly poor state. The actual U.S. poverty line for Mississippi, is 9.8. But if you start to go in and look, so in Jackson, the small dark circles are the individuals below poverty, which is the top number. The larger dark circles are female-headed households with children under 5 below poverty. So 23% in Jackson are below poverty, 53.5% of female-headed households are. And just to contextualize, in 1999, below poverty would be for one person $8,200. For 2 people, it's $11,000, and for 4 people, it's $16,000. So this is not a lot of money to exist on. Additionally, I brought up the issue of hospitals. So if hospitals became access points, some are, but a lot aren't, especially in Mississippi, most aren't. The state has 112 hospitals. That drastically starts to change where a woman could go to seek access. As well, when you start to think about pharmacies, there's 462 pharmacies in the state. So if you could get there to get emergency contraception, if the pharmacist will actually sell it to you, that becomes another access point. And so in our data collection, there were 287 male pharmacists compared to 175. 66% of male pharmacists would not carry emergency contraception, and 55% of female pharmacists would not carry contraception. We got hung up on. They would tell us they don't sell it, you need a prescription, we stock it but I won't dispense it, no one working on staff today will sell it. It was crazy. It was crazy. Some of the comments we got as a result of calling and acting or trying to seek whether we could get the prescription filled. Another thing is clearly cultural influence is religion. So in the state of Mississippi, there are 8,242 religious institutions. And this is not to say all religious institutions are bad, but it's a cultural context. So in Jackson, there are 451 religious institutions in that city. And so I mapped that through all of the cities and towns of the state just to understand one of the influences that's happening in the state. And then I started to speculate. So based on poverty rates, based on transportation hubs, based on pharmacy locations and hospitals, where, if in our ideal world, could clinics be located that would allow a far different landscape of access. So some of these crossroads become places where clinics should be located. So I just want to conclude, and I want to return back to Elizabeth Gross for just one moment, because I want to argue that architects, that we have the potential to produce change, and as spatial producers, we have the ability to reorganize and create differently people's everyday environments. abortion being one of those spaces, abortion clinics. So she asked how to think architecture differently, how to think in architecture or of architecture without conforming to the standard assumptions. She also asked, insofar as architecture is seeking not so much innovation, not simply the latest fad, but to produce differently, to engender the new, to risk creating otherwise, how do we keep architecture open to its outside? How to force architecture to think? And when I read that, it so resonated with me with this work. And I know these are incredibly difficult questions that I can't exactly answer, but that's what's motivated me to even do this work, and thinking about how spaces such as clinics, women's shelters, and hospitals become a place where we can find architectural agency. So one of the direct results of this research, and I return back to the clinic in Mississippi, is I'm working with architects, the group in New York, and we're going to be designing a competition for this fence. When I first went there several years ago, and in talking to the owner, and I said, you know, clearly this fence is a huge issue. It's a public-private divide. It's on your property line, but it's a huge problem because you don't have real security. You don't have privacy for the women, the patients, the families, and the practitioners who come here. So I would imagine an architect or an artist would be thrilled to do some sort of installation in this fence, to do all these things that you're talking about. So we're in the process of designing this competition. I was there back in August, and it was 100 degrees, and they had this black plastic sheeting duct taped to the fence, that there's no oral privacy at all, and it's incredibly hot. And it happens that this clinic is now located in the Arts District of Jackson, Mississippi. So it's this Shishi area that has tons of protesters, and it's a huge issue. There's an architecture office right across the street, and I met with him, and he said the noise levels get so bad that he's installed plexi to try, a plexi material to try and reduce the noise in his office, because they can't work, it gets so loud. But there's nothing else that's being done to try and mitigate some of the issues. So this street gets lined with protesters, not every day, but quite often, and they're allowed to stand in that public space thoroughway. So what we're talking about and planning is for the installation to happen here, and I've been looking at building codes, looking at issues of plants, how could plants start to be, you know, living walls, things that could house security, camouflage security, but also dampen noise and create more of a visual barrier. So that's going to be coming up in the near future. So I hope all of you would be interested to participate. But with that, I'd love to take questions. Thank you. Yes.
How do you think their research can be restructured and get Planned Parenthood?
You know, I think I would have been far more focused on the object rather than the things that impact and actually create the object. So I think it freed me from the clinic itself, although going to visit a lot of these clinics was really interesting from an architectural standpoint. I mean, there was one clinic who'd actually worked with an architect, the rest had not. And actually she had done some really interesting things with patient flow, but it really helped, it forced me to have to think, well, what's architecture's role? What could architecture's role be to think about the broader issues of space and access rather than the building itself? So I don't know where I would have ended up if I'd been able to go meet with Planned Parenthood and the people who work there, but I think it's a more, it offers more speculation as a result of having to think more broadly about it.
Managed to speak to anybody who are Jackson centers and also have abortions and is maybe, you know, they're creating mechanisms in terms of they might not experience space of other people.
Well, I was supposed to interview and speak with Ann Fergan, who's in San Francisco, and she's designed a number of Planned Parenthood clinics. Actually, they're quite beautiful spaces. And sadly, the interview never was able to happen. She was willing, but it was just a timing issue. But now that another part of this is going to be looking at building codes, which I never thought I would ever be looking at them from this perspective, but there's been a lot of push changing building codes to become ambulatory care versus, say, medical office, which has dramatic effects and are closing a lot of clinics. So I want to talk to her about how she's been able to creatively interpret building codes to do what she's done in I think it's outside, I think they were Los Angeles, in the Los Angeles area. But I think that's a really good point to think about. But there is, I mean, she's the one architect I know of that's published work and is very and is very public about her working with Planned Parenthood. You don't see that very often. And in fact, I was just talking to this lawyer in Pennsylvania who's part of the Women's Law Project, and she said they were trying to argue for not changing the building codes, and she said, you know, I'm a lawyer, I have no idea, I don't understand these, there's a whole other language, and I was trying to find, she said, a feminist architecture group that would be able to advise them, but she couldn't find any, because that's I think our professions being used, or the building codes that we deal with are being used to shut down clinics. But we don't hear many architects speaking up as to why these changes make no sense. So that's an area that I want to take on as a result of this.
So one thing that actually did make that sense, can you talk a little bit more in detail about how that did solve the patient flow?
Sure. Well, this one, it was a doctor that I met with, and she has several clinics actually. Some in Las Vegas and some in Phoenix, and so she was, you know, she thinks this needs to be far more mainstream. So the one in Las Vegas is there's an issue of where people can protest because it's not that far from the public street. But the one in Phoenix, who she used an architect with, is in a medical complex. And she said that is just, she realized that was a really good solution, that you get embedded within a medical complex where no one knows where you're going. And the fact that then you have to assume that every woman walking into this like 7-story building is going to her office, that's absurd. But the architect, and it was part architect, part doctor, so she wanted the patient to be able to exit a different space than you enter. So there were different circulation routes for those who were going in just to see or as a consult versus those who had the procedure and leave. And so I was asking her, so the people that your friend or whomever comes with you to support you, you know, they don't know you've left. She's like, well, we just let them know and they meet them outside the clinic. But there's 2 very clear, distinct circulation zones embedded within their space. So you never ever know when people go in, and you never know if they leave. So that's actually quite interesting because, you know, in a typical office, doctor's office, you always see the person coming back through the waiting area. So it's a small thing, but had quite profound effects just in the anonymity a patient can maintain after having a procedure. So it's not about nice finishes, although the Anne Fergen's finishes are amazing, I mean, in terms of a medical space, but it's really thinking through the use and the pragmatics of how these spaces function that I think architects are really important, as well as thinking about security issues, because there's I think it's a PBS, one PBS show I saw, and I'm blanking on its name. They interviewed the doctor. He's an older man who has a clinic in Boulder, and he's been quite outspoken. He does late-term abortions. He's had to install, I think there's 4 sets of security doors because his clinic's been shot at. So literally these things are kind of tacked on with no architectural or no spatial kind of consideration. So I think architects offered a way of thinking about this that is just not being considered. But so often someone would say to me, one of the people I was interviewing, well, we just don't have the money to work with an architect. Like the assumption is that we would be too expensive, that we can't afford it. And I was trying to, you know, convince them that, well, there are reduced fees, there's ways to have sliding scales, you know, just like with what you do, sometimes people can't always afford the procedure, so what do you do? So I was trying to advocate that we actually are far more flexible than they think we are, but there's a certain persona out in the public that we're just not affordable. Right. Oh, right. I think it is, we need to be far more of a public advocate, absolutely. And I think we need to take on, and I'm not for free, doing work for free, but reduce rate, finding a way to be able to work with these types of spaces is critical for architecture out in the world for, regular people, right? Right. More often than not, these are in refurbished, renovated buildings or spaces that in no way were ever thought or considered to be clinics. There was one actually in North Carolina where it was the access point, so they were in this industrial park, which was also a kind of strange location, or I missed it the first time I tried to find it, and then there were people outside, and then I realized, oh, those are the protesters, so that's where I'm trying to go. But there was this ongoing saga about a fence, and so the fence had been a security fence, a visible, at first was hedges, and then the FBI said, oh, you need to remove that because people could plant bombs in there. And finally, it took years, and the owner decided, okay, I'll remove it. But then they had, it wasn't quite a buffer zone, but there was a legislated line that the police and the federal marshals were supposed to maintain. And this line was basically rebar with wire through it, and they were noticing, the employees were noticing that this line kept shifting, so that the protesters would move it closer and closer to the clinic. And so eventually, the owner said, I've got to build another fence, like this just can't keep happening because they're getting closer and closer. And there's also these big trees in front of the clinic, so protesters would climb up onto the trees with bullhorns and yell things over or through the trees into the clinic. So there were some noise issues also. So eventually they agreed that she should build a wood privacy fence. And there's still this ongoing debate with the protesters. So it's all about the fence and how you provide a kind of buffer. It's definitely not camouflage, but a buffer from the street to the clinic, back to the clinic. Because without that fence, you actually do have some visual transparency into the clinic, which is definitely not a good idea in terms of being able to understand where activity and what's happening where. So the fence became, for her, a really important spatial element that was providing some safety. But another clinic in Birmingham, it got bombed, and actually someone was killed because they'd planted a bomb in a flower pot beside the entrance. And so then the FBI was like, you have to get rid of everything around the clinic. You can't have any garbage disposal or garbage pickup. It has to be all away. So there's this back and forth with federal agents and local police about how you create zones of safety, and they're not always in sync with one another, and also goes against what the clinic owners intuitively are thinking about what creates a safe space. So it's quite conflicted in that way. And there's the FACE law, which Clinton signed in '93, which is supposed to make it illegal that you would be prosecuted if you that you damaged a building or a religious space. But it's not being upheld to the degree that it needs to be. Uh-huh. Right. Well, it would be, but there's an issue, and a lot of the doctor in Arizona, and even Carol Joff, who's a sociologist at UC San Francisco, who's written for decades on abortion and done research, talks about, well, if it remains hidden, it remains, the thing that you have to seek out privately, that it's still a shaming, and that it really needs to be mainstreamed. It needs to be in regular medical practices. It needs to be in medical complexes, so that it's just one of many different types of medical services you could find. So the worry is that if it continues to still be this isolated, and it's going to continue to be that for, I'm sure, the foreseeable future, that it's going to continue to perpetuate the ability and ease for protests to seek them out. I mean, mobility, yes, but then it becomes this this thing you have to be in the know to be able to locate, which is not necessarily good either. So, but yeah. Go ahead.
I was just wondering whether or not there were differences in the social questions that emerge from the
Oh, I think it's very different. And in fact, with the, there's a lot of discussion about the move towards ambulatory requirements, that those have to pretty much be ground-up construction. Well, it's easier if it's ground-up construction, because otherwise it's incredibly expensive to, input really expensive HVAC systems and fireproofing that's far more extensive than what would be for just a medical office. So it's a completely different approach, and you would have to know beforehand that that's the kind of space or the level at which building codes would need to be implemented before they get built. And Planned Parenthood that's the kind of clinics they've been building with the foresight, I guess, that this is going to become the norm rather than the regular building codes for medical offices. So it's definitely a different spatial type completely in terms of what it needs, where it's located. I don't know about where it's located, but definitely how it gets built and built out. It's not that they can't, they can, and they used to be, actually, and they only went to clinics because hospitals were having so many protests, and it was so disruptive that they decided gradually that they didn't want to continue to provide these services. So it's not that they can't, and in fact they do, but not all of them do. And if you're religiously affiliated, so there's been a huge increase in Catholic-owned or Catholic-run hospitals, and they will not provide reproductive health care generally. So that means if a hospital gets bought out and that's your hospital, but it's a Catholic-run hospital, then you have to go somewhere else to get care. So it's one of the safest procedures in medicine. So it's not that hospitals can't do it; it's that they opted not to do it. So if it becomes more like Canada, where that's a permanent point of contact, I think that would help immensely. But we have this thing called the conscientious clause. So in certain states, and if your conscience doesn't allow you to do it, then you don't have to, and that's a huge problem too. And so pharmacies don't fill prescriptions because they don't believe in it, because they can evoke their conscience, the conscientious clause. It could, but it does. But it seems targeted towards reproductive health care access. Yes, exactly. So then it starts to become far more broader discrimination.
What about spaces for service such as assisted hypnosis? I don't know where that happens.
Right. I actually don't know. That's a really good question. I think it's Oregon. Yeah, that would be a good comparison to look at. I don't know. Yeah. Right. Yes, and when I'm beginning to look at building codes, I want to look at it's not parallel, but somewhat related medical services that aren't held to the same requirements as a way to demonstrate what is called a trap law. So it's targeting abortion providers when this could be very applicable to cosmetic surgery and other types of outpatient surgery. So that's definitely on my list of things to look at as a comparison to try to make that argument. Mm-hmm. Sure. I mean, I can't tell you everything, but I was reading recently, so I can tell you what I remember. So ambulatory requirements are for surgery. When I was talking to this lawyer the other day, she's like, that means when there's an incision and blood, I mean, her example was blood could spurt, so everything then has to be able to be cleaned extensively. She goes, but that doesn't happen in abortion care most generally. So that requirement doesn't seem to make sense, but it would require far more hygienic surface material, which is a different grade of material. Their fire code are far more stringent. You have to have far more controlled HVAC systems with, I think it's air purifying systems within it, like HEP kind of filters. There's weird requirements like sizes of closets that have to be a certain depth that can hold a certain amount of things. The doors have to be a certain dimension. The hallways are much larger, so for wheeling people in and out, and I think it's, I can't remember the dimension, but it was far larger than even 2 gurneys. So when we start to talk about moving walls, I mean, we're talking about basically having to gut a lot of these clinics and build them anew. Yes? Basically. Far more restrictive. So it starts to, I mean, the cost is prohibitive, and it's closed a lot of clinics in Virginia and Texas. And that seems to be the push, is let's try to make them more like hospitals so that it's, I mean, they won't say that it's to shut them down, but that's what's happening. So clearly that's the motivation. Because they claim, and one of the providers, like, they're going to claim it's for safer care, but the medical clinic building code has worked for decades. So why all of a sudden, is this now going to be safer? And then starting to think about, well, why is one state requiring this kind of code, but then it's not required in all the states? So is it not as safe in one state if they don't have ambulatory requirements versus another state? Like, it's so different state to state.
I'm also wondering about moving on pointing at architects getting involved in the legislation around these codes, because presumably the money can be found to knock down these clinics, build them from scratch to follow the new codes, but then this next layer of legislation
that could happen.
So I'm wondering if you could say a little bit more about architects involved in that legislation.
Sure. I mean, I would first say that the money can't be found, and that's why a lot of these clinics are closing. So in our ideal world, sure, the money could be found, but it actually can't, and many of them are operating on a shoestring budget as it is. But and I haven't done any research into this area, but talking to this lawyer, I said, there's no architects involved in changing these building codes. They're basically bureaucrats, and then the health department, but the health department is separate than the building code department. The health department has to oversee and enforce it, but the building code department is the one who actually writes them. And I've been thinking about, well, why aren't architects on the building? Why aren't we writing those building codes or being a part of that conversation? And very often, I mean, I need to go through and literally map out who comprise, like for a state, who writes these building codes. But I have not seen anywhere where architects are speaking up or out for why this is a good idea or why this isn't a good idea, or alternatives for this. So I think in terms of our discipline being proactive, like, this is an important, like it or not, this is an important part of how we have to ensure that the built environment is safe. And we should not just be following the codes, but we should actually be creating the codes. Yeah, I mean, I have no doubt that it gets played out in many different ways, but it seems it's hard not to see strategic work towards reducing and or eliminating clinics as a way to control or prevent access. But so I think our discipline has to step up and far more knowledge. I mean, we're supposed to be experts of the built environment. I mean, we're trained to do this and to read these things and to, so where are we in this? Mm-hmm. Oh, yeah. Sure. Yeah. Right. Well, I mean, this is kind of a dumb thing, but I was thinking, well, what if, you do diagrams of what the medical space is, just office space, and then diagrams of what ambulatory, what are the changes they're trying to get clinics to do, and also associated with the financial burden of that. And I know money should not play into life safety issues, but if you start to see that for the kinds of procedures that are happening there, that these, I mean, and people know, I mean, the owners, the doctors know that they don't need those strict requirements. It makes no sense. But I keep thinking, and the lawyer, she's like, she goes, that would be incredibly useful to have representation that shows what that means, because these are not architects looking at what that means spatially. So if a door is 3 feet versus 4 feet, and you have to move a wall, if you start to demonstrate what those things do to the space, because some of the codes I was reading are just, they don't make any sense in terms of how that would be safer care. Mm-hmm. Right. Yeah. But I think it would have to be in collaboration with practitioners and lawyers, and so it would not just be me doing these diagrams, but I'm going to be consulting with other people as a way to hopefully strengthen the argument. But there hasn't been anything done that she was able to find to help them be able to argue this more clearly. Like she said, they had a very difficult time trying to explain why this wasn't necessary from a space use and safety perspective, because it is completely couched in, oh, well, this is safer care. Right. That's the moniker.
Do you think it's because the people who are reinforcing these policies don't really know the procedure is?
No, I think they're intentionally trying to restrict. I mean, it's intentional and very successful so far. Right. Right. Yeah. I mean, I read all these FEMA guidelines when I was writing this. Oh my God, it was just painful. And those were really more for larger scale buildings. But to go back to the doctor in Boulder, so there's cameras everywhere. I mean, every clinic had cameras everywhere, and he had these bulletproof glass doors. That you'd enter, you'd get locked in, and then this one would release. You enter again, and I think there was one more set. So there was that kind of situation. And in other clinics, there would either be a gate that you had to walk through that was a metal detector, or the wand. So they're more low tech. I mean, the Boulder situation was far more expensive. But in the other clinics I visited, it was more low-tech, wand, I'm going to keep your purse, you can't bring these things back, after you've been in the entrance. But it's been I didn't see any that were thinking of this or implementing it in a more, I don't mean sophisticated in a bad way, but in a way that was more thought out. I think it was they're stopgap measures, and they said, this one woman in particular said, after 9/11, like, security had to increase, and that's when they started wanding people. Yeah, and so I asked her that, and she said, well, yes, but then people were willing to sacrifice that because the assumption is that you're safer once you're in this space because your body's been surveilled, or who's with you has also been surveilled. So they were willing to give up some of that in order to have more. Oh yeah, no, absolutely, absolutely. Like, it was kind of shocking, yeah, that you'd have to do this to get into the clinic. Right, no, you just walk in. There was there was minimal security. Yeah. Right. Yeah, and I forgot to mention, so I helped a clinic in Syracuse. I did some redesign work for their interior, and they were very much of the mindset that this is going to be private. But I happened to get connected with this woman who is she was working on rewriting policy in Washington State for domestic violence, and there in Washington State and actually other areas in the western coast, they are trying a different perspective where the women's shelter is actually public. It's embedded in a community. The community knows. The community actually helps support it and is very aware when there are people around and report. So there's a move towards going, in at least the shelter world, of making it not camouflaged and hidden, because in some ways it's the same issue as the clinic. It further it reinforces that this is a really unfortunate situation and you have to remain hidden because that makes you safer. But they found in these other clinics, and I helped review their policy, that they were having huge success. And so some of the cases would be literally there's a freestanding building that the whole community knows. They raise money, they publicly raise money to build this, so everyone in the community is aware that this is a women's shelter. There were other examples where they would rent or own spaces in apartment complexes. So the women, the survivors, would be spread out through apartment complexes where no one knew who anyone was, but then there was the office that they would go to for their supplies and food and whatnot, but they were far more individually able to exist on their own, because one of the things they were saying is that by having to be hidden, you sever all ties to your support community, and that's incredibly detrimental just in getting back on your feet and trying to move in a better direction. So with these different areas or different examples of varying degrees of publicness, they're able to maintain their support structure, which is proving to be emotionally and psychologically far more beneficial. So it's, happens the one I was working for was very old school in the sense that we're going to remain hidden. But it was interesting to see, and there's many more. She sent me all these examples of clinics, and they're more on the West Coast of how they're really changing that mentality to the benefit of both the community, because then the community can be invested and involved, and to the women and their families.
So it seems like a lot of the sort of anti-choice strategies take place within the private sphere, legislating the private community. And go to extremes to sort of create an assault on the physical and emotional and psychological side of speech. Have you seen strategies that are pro-choice that are able to exploit the public space?
Yeah. I actually didn't, when I was interviewing, I didn't feel comfortable photographing any of these clinics. I didn't want to further publicize them, but so I'll give you a few examples, which one was hilarious. So this one clinic in Alabama, the protesters would stand in her grass, and so she installed a sprinkler system. And every time the protesters were there, she would ignite the sprinkler system, and they would get soaked. And this, I mean, she continues to do it. So it was, you know, and it was a way just to get back in their face, really. But you know, she needs to water the grass, so she could couch it in that it's really about maintenance of building site than it was about anything else. This other. Actually, in Mississippi, one thing they've done, because noise levels get so loud, is that they have these industrial fans. And this is not, I mean, I know if I lived or worked in this area, I would be quite upset of how this is impacting the environment. And that's one reason I want us to work with her. But so she would have, and she has industrial fans in that zone where people were walking through to try and, you know, mitigate some of the noise. They also have music that they play in certain days, and there was one other one that was pretty funny. The sprinklers, and then this other doctor in the Midwest, he would just blare either like the Star Spangled Banner or classical music, just way beyond the level that you could hear anything, and it would be on his property out towards the protesters. And then, so I think the best one was the sprinklers that I encountered, like just in terms of creatively trying to play against what the anti-choice protesters were doing. I mean, it's a really interesting issue when we think about it spatially, because you want people to be able to protest. We believe in free speech, but like with the examples I showed, at what point does access become at least equally as important as the ability of free speech? And so far, I think the Supreme Court has always ruled in the favor, or most likely ruled in the favor of free speech. And we understand why, but it seems to, I mean, one thing I've struggled with is it seems to be more of this intellectual issue versus an on-the-ground physical issue. And so what I'm trying to show is, well, it may make sense on paper, but it doesn't make sense when you live through that or have to experience it in real life, in real space.
But similarly, if a clinic that provides abortions can't advertise that they do that is in some way impinging on their free speech. It's like if you took the example of people really hating McDonald's and people came out to protest McDonald's, and McDonald's has to hide and shroud itself in secrecy. I'm sure that corporation would say, well, this is impinging on our free speech and our freedom of expression,
right,
of what our brand means.
Right.
So it's just clearly like severely asymmetrical in terms of whose speech it qualifies as speech.
Right. Well, we see it as that way, right? But others see it differently.
All right. Well, I think we should move on. We should keep drinking.